the respect for life, the criticism of attachment and greed, the sensitivity to the suffering of others, and a spiritual path independent of temples and priests. There are many parallels between Buddhism and Christianity, but are these parallels just parallels, or has there been some historical crossover between these traditions? Was Jesus a Buddhist in 1st century Palestine? Before I actually begin the discussion here, I'd like to say that it's very important that you watch this video until the end, because otherwise you might leave with a half-truth, and that wouldn't be good. The explanation is only meant to be understood as a whole, so if you leave the video before the end, please ignore everything I said, okay? So let's get started. In 1887, the Russian aristocrat Nikolai Notovitch made a long journey through India, passing through the Caucasus, Kashmir, and Ladakh, which is a region of the Himalayas with great Tibetan influence. In that last region, he allegedly visited the Hemis Monastery, where a document about the life of Saint Isa, which is the Arabic name for Jesus, was supposedly preserved. A few years later, in 1894, Notovitch published a French translation of this document, titled The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. According to this text, Jesus would have fled home at the age of 13, probably to escape an arranged marriage, and joined a group of merchants with whom he would eventually end up in India. There, he supposedly came into contact with Jainism, which is one of the oldest traditions in India, and also studied the Vedas, which are the Hindu sacred scriptures, so to speak, with the Brahmin priests. The problem is that Jesus would not have silently accepted the teachings of the priestly caste, always raising many questions, and this would have ended up placing a death sentence upon him. To escape this fate, Jesus would have fled to the land of the Gautamites, where he would learn Pali, which is the language of the oldest Buddhist sacred texts. And after advancing significantly in the teachings of the tradition, he would have been sent from there to spread the teachings of Buddha throughout the world. Finally, after many wanderings, he would eventually return to Israel, carrying a message of compassion and nonviolence, and that the heart is more sacred than any temple built by human hands. The local authorities in Israel, especially among the temple priests, would not have taken kindly to this message, and that's why Jesus would end up being executed by crucifixion. This text presented by Notovitch did not just come out of nowhere, nor did it fall from the sky into Europe. Since the late 19th century, some European authors, within a growing field of study at the time, which was comparative religions, were already drawing parallels between Buddhism and Christianity, and even suggested that the tradition of Buddha, which is 400 to 500 years older, could have directly influenced the thinking of Jesus. But for this hypothesis to be truly plausible, historically speaking, at least one of two things would have had to happen. Either Jesus would have had to go meet Buddhism, as in the story presented by Notovitch, or Buddhism would have had to somehow reach the present-day Palestinian region. So let's consider each of these possibilities. First, is it really possible that Jesus went to India? To answer this question, the first thing to do is to consult the oldest sources we have about the life of Jesus, and these are the canonical Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. It's interesting to note that the Gospel of Mark, which was probably the first to be written, around the year 70, 40 years after the death of Christ, doesn't say a single word about Jesus' childhood. The story begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, then recounts a series of miracles, reaches its climax in the passion and execution of Jesus, and ends with the resurrection. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, perhaps pressured by popular curiosity about Jesus' childhood, present a very brief account at the beginning of their texts about this period. But these accounts are basically limited to the birth of Jesus, and they even contain many discrepancies between themselves, seeming more concerned with making certain theological statements, comparing Jesus' personal history mainly with the national history of Israel than with answering truly historical questions. In any case, nothing in the Gospels suggests that Jesus left the present-day region of Palestine except for one passage in Matthew chapter 2, when Joseph takes the infant Jesus to Egypt, but only for a short time, just enough to escape the massacre of children ordered by King Herod. Now, outside the Gospels, it's possible to find some more elaborate stories about Jesus' childhood, in which which he even resurrects animals and brings to life birds made of clay, and things of that sort. But these texts are already from the 2nd and 3rd centuries onwards, and are considered by historians as practically irrelevant for clarifying the real history of Jesus. They are very important for understanding the various forms of Christianity that developed later, but not for resolving 1st century questions. And even if they were relevant for reconstructing history, none of them places Jesus anywhere near India. So, is it possible that Jesus traveled to India? Impossible it is not. But there is absolutely nothing in terms of ancient documents that points even indirectly to this. But what about Notovitch's document, you might be wondering? Well, ever since The Unknown Life of Jesus, which is the book translated by him, was published in Europe, several scholars began to strongly doubt this story. And one of them, the Englishman James Archibald Douglas, traveled to the Hemis Monastery, where the document was supposedly found, and confirmed by interviewing the abbot of that monastery that Nikolai Notovitch had never been there, and that this text about the life of Saint Isa was completely unknown in the region, and that the Pali language, which would supposedly be the language in which it was originally written, was never even used in that region. Some sources even claim that Notovitch himself later admitted to the forgery of this text, but the reality of this confession is somewhat controversial. Now, if it is highly improbable that Jesus went to India, it is much less improbable that India came to Jesus. So let's consider this second possibility. Buddhism arose in India around the 5th century BC, but only expanded more systematically to other regions in the 3rd century BC, during the time of the Indian Emperor Ashoka. This emperor was responsible for sending several Buddhist missionaries around the world, who even reached Greek territories and had some influence there. Even before that, in fact, Buddhism already had a presence in Eastern Europe or in Western Asia because of the conquests of Alexander the Great, who connected with his enormous empire territories from Macedonia and Greece all the way to a piece of the Indian subcontinent. So it's interesting to note that some figures close to Jesus, in space and time, had some knowledge of the existence of Buddha's tradition. Philo of Alexandria, for example, was a Jewish philosopher roughly contemporary with Jesus, and he acknowledges the presence of Buddhists in 1st century Egypt. Clement of Alexandria, a Christian writer of the 2nd century, speaks of Indians who obey the precepts of Buddha and, because of their extraordinary holiness, give him divine honors. So, incredible as it may seem, there really were Buddhists not far from Palestine in the time of Jesus. Now, does this relative proximity really point to an actual historical connection between Jesus and Buddha? No. Once again, even among people from the 1st centuries after Christ, who knew both traditions, Christianity and Buddhism, there is no direct mention whatsoever that Jesus' teachings derived in any way from those of Buddha. Only much later, from the 19th century onwards, would anyone propose this dependence of Christianity on Buddhism. So, after all, is it possible that this Buddhist presence in the vicinity of Palestine had some impact on Jesus' thinking? Again, possible. Almost anything is possible. The question is, why, in the absence of significant evidence on the matter, would anyone choose to believe that Jesus had been a Buddhist monk or something of the sort? Generally, what leads people to this position is the fact that there are indeed many parallels between the teachings of these figures, Buddha and Christ. For example, respect for life, for the weakest, the rejection of violence, and the valuing of interiority, of the heart, above external religious practices. According to some, this ethics and spirituality of Jesus would mark an absolutely radical rupture with Judaism, and would therefore suggest a more remote origin, as in the Indian traditions, for example. But this is completely false. Jesus' preaching has precedence in his own tradition. As for the respect for life and the weakest, for example, the Torah already said that human beings are the very image of God, and the defense of the orphan and the widow is something recurrent throughout the entire Old Testament, especially in the prophets. Jesus' declaration that the meek shall inherit the earth, in fact, comes directly from a Jewish psalm, Psalm 37, which says, "The meek shall inherit the earth and delight themselves in the abundance of peace." As for the rejection of violence, a Jewish proverb says, "Do not envy the violent man, nor choose any of his ways." And another psalm says, "The Lord examines the righteous and the wicked. He hates whoever loves violence." And finally, regarding the valuing of interiority above appearances, is. There is an infinity of passages in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament of Christians, when, for example, the prophet Amos, speaking on behalf of the God of Israel, says the following: I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your solemn assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Even though you bring me the best fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away from me with the noise of your songs and the music of your harps. Instead, let righteousness roll on like a river, justice like a never-failing stream. Or then, to make one last quotation, the prophet Jeremiah, a Jew, declared the following: Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words, saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. But if you really change your ways and your actions, if you truly practice justice, each one with his neighbor, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, nor follow other gods to your own harm, I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave to your ancestors forever and ever. So, the question is this: if, on the one hand, the most elaborate contortions are needed to conclude that Jesus received Buddhist teachings, on the other hand, all you have to do is open practically any page of the oldest biographies of Jesus, which are the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to come across explicit references to Jewish teachings. So, in conclusion, did Jesus have contact with Buddhists, Hindus, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, or anything of the sort? It's hard to say, but one thing is certain: Jesus was a Jew, the son of Jews, called Jews to be apostles, and preached to Jews. So, to seek the origins of Jesus' teaching and to understand the life of Jesus, it seems much more historically viable to turn to the history of the Jews, to the culture of the Jews. So that's it. If this kind of analysis interests you, hit like and subscribe for more.